I never asked for anything extravagant. Not the house. Not the car. Not the jewelry my siblings always found reasons to argue over. All I ever wanted was the garden. That patch of uneven soil in the back with its drooping fence and stubborn lavender bush. And her promise. It was early October. The kind of autumn afternoon where the light softens everything it touches like it's trying to make peace with the coming cold. I stood out there with pruning shears in one hand, a cracked terracotta pot beside me, and the scent of lavender holding onto the air like it didn't want to leave either. Through the kitchen window, I could see Mom sitting in her chair, her frame smaller than I remembered, shoulders draped in the same blue cardigan she'd worn for 3 days straight. She used to keep this yard alive, spent every spring morning out here coaxing tomatoes and geraniums into blooming. Now she mostly watched. And I tried not to think about how little time we had left with these quiet afternoons. The bush had overgrown since summer. I clipped carefully, mindful not to tug too hard. Each cut released a burst of scent that made me pause. Not because it was special, but because it was familiar. Because it reminded me of simpler years. From behind the glass, Mom waved. Her hand shook a little, but the smile was steady. I waved back, then turned toward the compost bin to toss the clippings. As I did, my eye caught the edge of a wooden stake we'd hammered in years ago, marking the line where she wanted to plant heirloom roses. We never got around to it. That was the thing about time. It kept us busy until it didn't. I wiped my hands on the side of my jeans and went back inside, the screen door creaking behind me. The air was warmer in the kitchen, thick with the smell of reheated chicken soup and something faintly floral. Mom's lavender sachets tucked behind every cabinet door like tiny wards against the world changing too fast. She was still by the window, her lap draped with a fleece throw the color of buttercream. Her hands, once strong enough to turn soil and knead bread for 4, now trembled just lifting a teacup. I brought her the good one, ceramic, hand-painted with forget-me-nots. It used to be part of a set, but time and tile floors had taken care of that. "Smells like fall out there," she said, voice soft but certain. "It's a good day for trimming," I replied, setting the cup down on a cork coaster. "Lavender's hanging on, but barely." She smiled at that like I'd just given her some good news. "Do you remember when we planted it?" I asked, easing into the armchair across from her. "You had that straw hat with the fake sunflower, and Jordan kept stepping on the hose." Mom gave a little chuckle, barely a sound, but it lit her eyes. "I missed that garden," she said, then hesitated. "But I'm glad you're keeping it going. You always did the tending." I shrugged. "You taught me how." "No," she said more firmly now. "I may have shown you how to dig a hole, but you're the one who stayed." There was a pause. I looked down at my hands, lying dry from the wind, the kind of hands that never left home. "They don't come back much anymore, do they?" she asked after a moment. I knew she didn't mean the neighbors. "No," I said gently. "Not really." She nodded like she already knew the answer. Her fingers traced the rim of the cup slowly, thoughtfully. "They're busy." That's what they always say. Busy. The word sat between us like a folded letter no one wanted to read. She turned her gaze back toward the window, watching the wind push at the maple leaves until they let go. "You know," she said slowly, "Gavin always said he'd build something out there. A studio maybe, or a guest cottage." My stomach tightened just a little. "He said a lot of things," I murmured. She looked at me then, really looked, and for a moment her face was sharper than usual. Her eyes found mine the way they used to when I was a child trying to lie about cookies or bad grades. "Ellie," she said quietly, "someday that land out back will be yours." I didn't say anything. The silence was soft, not awkward. But it had weight to it. "You kept this home alive," she added. "Not just the flowers. The people. Me." I reached over, gently tucked the throw higher on her lap. "You don't have to say that, but I want to." She reached out and I took her hand, feeling the papery skin, the memory of strength beneath it. "I may forget other things," she whispered, voice catching, "but not what you've given me." I blinked fast. Outside, a squirrel scattered across the fence top carrying a walnut like it was a crown. "Thank you," I said, simply. That was the thing about my mother, she didn't often say things directly. She'd leave a pie on the windowsill when she was sorry. She'd call me kiddo when she felt proud, But this was as clear as she got. And I held it like a candle in a room that had dimmed too early. Later that evening, after Mom had dozed off in her recliner with the television humming soft commercials about reverse mortgages, I stepped back out to the garden. The light had cooled to a dusky blue and the lavender bush looked almost silver under it. I bent down, ran my hand gently over the trimmed stems. They gave off one last breath of scent, like the echo of a song you didn't realize you'd been humming all day. At the far edge of the yard, the wooden stake still stood. The one we'd marked years ago. She'd wanted heirloom roses there, said she saw them in a catalog once, yellow with pink tips like watercolor. But the catalog was long gone and the roses never came. We were always putting things off. I knelt to pull a stubborn weed near the stake, and as I did I noticed the way the soil crumbled dry in my fingers. It hadn't rained in a week, but the roots had still held on. Resilient things, gardens. Inside, I could hear the faint ding of the microwave. Mom had probably woken up hungry. I stayed a minute longer. Took one of the clipped stems from the compost pile and tucked it into my coat pocket. The back steps creaked under my feet, a sound I knew by heart. Like so much in this place, it didn't need fixing, just remembering. In the kitchen, I poured her a glass of milk, added a few slices of apple, and brought it to her lap. "You always know," she smiled, eyes half-lidded. I sat beside her. We didn't talk much more. The kind of quiet we shared was never heavy. Just full. That night, after I helped her to bed and turned off the hallway light, I stood by the back door for a long time. The porch light cast a pale arc across the yard. Leaves rustled in the breeze, making that gentle papery sound like memories shifting in an old drawer. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the lavender stem I'd kept. Pressed it flat between the pages of a grocery list on the fridge. I didn't want it to dry up on its own. In this house, little things held meaning. A chipped mug, a folded napkin. A promise spoken not in contracts or paperwork, but over soup under fading sunlight in the in-between moments. I glanced toward the dark edge of the backyard. The garden. The patch she said would be mine someday. But memories aren't deeds. And promises don't hold up in court. The frost hadn't lifted when I buried her. It clung to the edges of the church windows, the sidewalk cracks, and the corners of the eulogy I didn't have the strength to write. We kept things simple per her wishes. No choir, no open casket. Just a rented chapel, a photo from 1972 in a wooden frame, and a vase of the last lavender I'd managed to clip before the snow came. I shook too much to speak, so Pastor Marianne did most of the talking. She said Mom was a quiet woman but steady. I didn't correct her. There wasn't space for truth in a room this cold. Afterward, Gavin drove us to Mr. Horowitz's office. It sat on a corner lot in a part of Syracuse that still had gas lamps and cracked bricks. An old Victorian home turned legal practice decades ago, with sagging porch steps and a doorbell that had to be pressed just right. Inside, the carpet was floral and tired. The air smelled like lemon pledge and old paper. It reminded me of every office Mom had visited in the last year: dentist, podiatrist, hospice intake. Ellie, Gavin said as we waited in the hallway. "You holding up okay?" I nodded. He didn't wait for an answer. Tina stood by the window, arms crossed the same way she always did when she didn't want to be asked how she was. Jordan flipped through a magazine with outdated recipes. No one mentioned Mom. When Mr. Horowitz finally opened the door, his smile was tight, polite. Like a man who'd rather be anywhere else. We filed in quietly like it was church all over again. The chairs in Mr. Horowitz's office were mismatched, two leather, one upholstered in something that used to be navy. I took the one farthest from the desk, nearest to the small bookcase, lined with framed degrees and one dusty photo of his golden retriever. Mr. Horowitz sat down slowly, folding his hands over a yellow legal pad. "Well," he began, voice quieter than I remembered first. "Let me extend my condolences again. Your mother was. She was very fond of all of you." I saw Tina blink once flatly. Gavin gave a slow, measured nod. Jordan didn't lift his head. He continued. "Margaret McKay finalized her will and property assignments in October of last year. I have the documents here signed, witnessed, and notarized. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a slim manila folder. I watched his fingers move more carefully than necessary, like he was unwrapping something fragile. He read aloud. All real and personal property, including the primary residence located at 318 Wexley Avenue NU, and the adjoining land parcels are to be transferred in full to Gavin McKay. There was no pause. No space for interpretation. No mention of fairness. I didn't react, not outwardly. I folded my hands in my lap, feeling my nails dig into my palm. He continued reading, detailing the minor items: bank accounts, a car that hadn't run since 2014, costume jewelry no one would claim. But I couldn't hear much past that date. He'd said, the 12th of October. I knew that date. 2 days later, I'd called 911 when Mom slumped over in her chair, unable to speak. She hadn't cooked dinner since. Hadn't walked without help. And yet, she had somehow reviewed and signed away her house, the garden, everything, just 48 hours before her world collapsed. I stared at the papers like they might confess something more if I looked hard enough. Mr. Horowitz laid the folder down gently, as if trying not to wake a ghost. No one moved. The ticking of a wall clock filled the silence, slow and indifferent. Then Gavin cleared his throat. She signed it, he said, like that was the end of it. It was her choice. I turned to look at him. Not harshly, just fully. He didn't flinch. Just kept that steady, neutral expression he'd perfected over the years. Like he was presenting quarterly numbers, not cutting through someone's spine. She was clear, he added. Said she wanted things simple. Tina shifted in her seat. Her coffee, brought in from the cafe across the street, sat untouched on the edge of the desk, lid still sealed. She hadn't even looked at me. I tried to speak, truly I did. But my throat was thick with something that didn't have a name. Not grief, not anger. Just the solid weight of being erased. Jordan finally spoke, voice low and quick, like he hoped no one would hear him. It's not about the house, right? It's about closure. Closure. What a tidy little word. I stared down at my mother's signature on the notarized document. It sloped downward at the end, like her hand had given up halfway through. The ink was smudged just slightly. Maybe her hand shook. Maybe she didn't see the line clearly. Maybe someone guided the pen. But none of that was written in the margins. It was legal, that's all that mattered now. And the silence in the room was thick with everyone knowing it. Mr. Horowitz pushed the papers toward me. You're welcome to review these, he said softly, as if volume might change the content. I didn't reach for them right away. Instead, I looked at the signature again. The one they all claimed was hers, chosen and clear. It wasn't. It was tired. There was a hesitation in the penstroke, a slight wobble where her M should have curled smoothly but instead collapsed inward. A smear across the G, like her hand had hovered too long or slipped altogether. There were initials on the bottom corner, hers technically. But they looked more like someone tracing an old habit than signing from intent. I finally picked up the pages. The paper felt too warm, like it had held someone else's hands too long. That was when I saw the date in the top right corner, the 12th of October 2022. I counted backwards without thinking. 2 days. 2 days before she collapsed in the kitchen chair. 2 days before I sat beside her at Upstate Medical, holding her wrist, while nurses whispered around me. And on that date, apparently she had the presence of mind to give away everything. Everything but me. Gavin leaned forward, resting his wristwatch against the edge of the desk. I know this is hard, Elle, but she wanted peace. She told me she didn't want to leave behind messes. A Montblanc pen rolled slightly on the surface beside him, catching a glint of afternoon light. I didn't respond. Because nothing I said would have made a difference. The decision had been signed, sealed, and socially accepted, and I was already being expected to absorb it quietly. Mr. Horowitz cleared his throat again, gently this time. If there are no objections, he said, looking around the room, but never quite at me, I'll proceed with the paperwork for execution. Tina gave a quiet nod. Jordan shifted in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor. Gavin clicked the cap on his pen with a kind of finality that echoed in my ears far louder than it should have. I folded the copy of the document and tucked it into my purse, not because I accepted it, but because something told me I might need to hold that paper one day just to remind myself it was real. No one spoke as we filed out. Tina tossed her full coffee into the bin without even tasting it. Gavin patted Mr. Horowitz on the shoulder and told him to get some rest. Jordan held the door open for me, then let it close a little too soon. We walked to our separate cars in silence. Snow had started to fall, small and hesitant, the kind that melts before it touches pavement. On the ride home, I didn't turn on the radio, didn't check my phone, didn't cry. I just watched the gray sky blur past, wondering when exactly my name had been left off the story. They'd already decided who deserved what. I was just there to hear it read out loud. The deli tray was still sweating through its plastic wrap when Gavin slid the funeral invoice across the table. We hadn't even opened the pickles. Sunlight filtered in through the half-closed blinds, casting long yellowish bars across the dining room Mom had once polished with lemon oil every Saturday morning. Now it smelled faintly of boiled eggs and something stale, maybe the dust, maybe old grief. Tina set out paper plates without looking up, stacking them beside a tub of potato salad from the grocery on 7th and Clark. Jordan poured lukewarm iced tea from a bottle, not bothering with ice. No one touched the casserole a neighbor had dropped off. I stood at the sideboard, placing napkins by habit. My hands moved on their own, like they still knew how to host even when I didn't feel like part of the family anymore. Gavin cleared his throat. "Well," he said, voice calm and businesslike, "we figured it makes the most sense for you to handle this." He tapped the paper once, then leaned back in the chair that had been Mom's. The document lay face up. Lot Babai Sishar. 19 funeral services, floral arrangements, headstone deposit. My name wasn't on it. But it might as well have been etched in the total. I sat down slowly, letting the chair creak beneath me. Tina finally spoke. "You've been living here, Elle. Rent-free. For years. It wasn't cruel. Not exactly." She said it the way people note the weather or traffic delays. Just a fact. I looked down at the invoice, then at Gavin's face, so smooth, so sure. He wasn't gloating, he didn't have to. He spoke with the kind of detachment that made it clear this wasn't personal. Just paperwork. Jordan shifted beside me, reached for a dinner roll, tore it in half, but didn't eat it. I wanted to say something. I wanted to remind them that when Mom slipped into unconsciousness, I was the one who stayed up all night counting her breaths. That I'd sat alone beside her hospital bed when the monitors stopped beeping, holding her hand until the nurse gently pried it from mine. But all I said was, "Okay." Tina raised her eyebrows, slightly surprised I hadn't put up more of a fight. Gavin nodded like we'd all behaved reasonably. "Thank you," he said. "It just keeps things smoother." Smoother. Like grief was a transaction that could be rounded up and filed away. I picked at the corner of the invoice. The paper was too clean, too sharp. Unlike the last weeks with Mom, where everything had frayed and blurred and softened at the edges. "I paid with time you'll never understand," I said quietly. It wasn't meant to accuse, just to correct the record. No one responded. Outside, a car passed slowly down the street, the crunch of its tires over leftover ice breaking the moment like glass. I took a sip of the iced tea. It was bitter and warm. Like the way they looked at me now, grateful I'd taken on the burden, relieved it hadn't cost them anything but politeness. Jordan was the one who finally moved. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a cheap blue ballpoint pen, something you'd find in a drawer full of forgotten coupons, and placed it beside the invoice. "Let's not make this emotional," he murmured. His voice was soft, as if he were trying to keep it from catching fire. He didn't meet my eyes. Tina stood and started clearing the table, lifting plates that still had food on them. Half a deviled egg. A scoop of salad no one wanted. Like we'd finished a meeting, not a meal. Gavin leaned back in his chair again. He always had a way of taking up space without effort, elbows just wide enough, legs angled just so. I wondered if he practiced it. I wondered if he thought of himself as the new head of the table. I signed it. Not because I agreed, not because I was the only one who should have, but because I knew arguing would do nothing. Because even when I opened my mouth to speak, I couldn't find the version of me they'd listen to. Silence can speak louder than outrage. And sometimes it's the only thing left when your words have been spent. They watched me write my name like they were waiting for a receipt. Tina dropped a fork in the sink with a clatter. Jordan pushed his chair back too fast. Gavin's phone buzzed and he glanced at it already somewhere else in his mind. They left quickly. No hugs. No drawn-out goodbyes. Just the sound of Gavin's leather shoes on the tile, the muted click of the front door, and the sudden quiet that followed. I stood in the kitchen staring at the half-full pot of soup I'd reheated earlier. No one had touched it. It wasn't even about the taste. They simply weren't hungry for anything I made anymore. I moved like muscle memory, rinsing plates, wiping down counters, stacking containers that would sit untouched in the fridge. The tea mugs still held heat when I poured them out. The steam curled up in soft ribbons, disappearing like breath on a winter morning. I should have cried, maybe. But I didn't. Grief, when slow, doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it just settles in your chest like a second heartbeat. Heavy, familiar. I opened the cupboard above the stove to put away the mugs. There, behind an old tin of gold medal flour, sat something I hadn't noticed in years. A notebook. Spine cracked, the corners soft and curling. It had once been cream-colored, now a dusty gray. The kind of thing you forget you saved until it finds its way back into your hands. I reached for it without thinking. My fingers brushed the tin, knocking it slightly. A small puff of flour spilled out onto the shelf, onto the cover of the notebook. It felt like something was waiting. Not urgent, just still. Like the house itself had been holding its breath all along. I brushed the flour from the cover and turned it over in my hands. It wasn't fancy. Just an old composition book with a faded marble design, the label on front long since smudged to nothing. I opened the first page. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mom's. A slanting script I'd watched her use on grocery lists, Christmas cards, and the notes she used to tuck into my lunch when I was still wearing braces. Spring, 1997, the top corner read. Below it, a single sentence. If anything happens, Ellie knows where everything is. My breath caught. It wasn't legal, it wasn't binding. But it was real. A dozen loose pages followed, half recipes, half thoughts. Some were labeled insurance, kitchen drawer check, garden lease, estate keys. Behind the China owl. Nothing that would stand in court. Everything that said she'd meant for me to understand this house, this life, was something I had built with her. Something I was supposed to keep. I closed the book gently. Outside, the porch light flickered on, evening settling in like an old cardigan across the shoulders. And for the first time since the funeral, I sat down at the table. Not to eat, not to clean, but to read what she left behind, not in law, but in love. The house had long gone quiet, but sleep never came. Not that night. I sat in my childhood room, knees tucked under me on the edge of the bed, the old notebook resting in my lap. The rain had started an hour ago, tapping soft patterns against the window pane like a slow metronome. It made the walls sound like they were breathing. The lamp on my nightstand flickered every so often. I kept meaning to replace that bulb, but there was something comforting in the way it fought to stay lit like everything else in this house. The pages smelled like flower and lavender and something older. Something like memory. I ran my fingers across the familiar ridges of her handwriting. Mom never kept a journal. She was too practical, too busy. But here, scattered between grocery lists and half-finished to-do items, was something closer. A trail. A whisper. The first page I read wasn't profound. Pick up extra cans of soup. Check porch light. Gavin coming Sunday. But even that felt like a breadcrumb, something she left behind without meaning to. The next entry was dated 3 weeks later. Doctor says circulation's still weak. Right hand slower now. Can't knit. Need to tell Ellie. Tell me what. I flipped forward past more fragments. Ellie's been quiet. I think she knows I'm fading. She never asks for anything. And then one that made me stop. Tina said the bills are too much. Gavin wants the deed moved. I'm tired of arguing. He says I'm being selfish. Maybe I am. My chest tightened. I'd heard those exact words before, just not from her. From Gavin. At the funeral. When he said she signed it, it was her choice. But what choice does someone have? When guilt is weaponized with a smile, the rain picked up slightly, tracing small rivers down the glass. I didn't move, didn't blink. Just turned the page like it might fall apart in my fingers if I rushed. I told Jordan I wasn't sure. He shrugged. Said he didn't want to be in the middle. That sounded like him. Always there. Never rooted. The ink on the next few lines had bled slightly, probably from dampness or a teacup once placed too close. Ellie made soup tonight. Chicken with barley. She never says anything, but she sees everything. I smiled despite myself. That had been my way then and now. Words always seemed too big for the feelings I carried. So I cooked. So I stayed. I turned another page. I'm not strong anymore. Gavin keeps pressing. Says it's better for taxes. Says Ellie would understand. But she won't say a word. Then in different ink, lighter, perhaps older Ellie should have the garden. I didn't fight him. I'm tired. I'm sorry. I stopped breathing. The air in the room shifted. It wasn't just regret I heard in her words, it was resignation. Like she had been made small too. Even here. It was never about money. Not for her, not for me. It was about being seen. About meaning something to the ones who claimed to love you. I looked down at my hands, how they shook just a little. I hadn't cried. Not during the reading of the will. Not when I signed the funeral check. But now. I felt something deeper. Not grief. Not anger. Recognition. I turned to the last few pages. They were thinner, creased near the spine from years of being pressed against the metal tin. One entry stood alone. Just a date. The 10th of October 2022. 2 days before she went to the hospital. 3 days before I called 911 when she couldn't lift her left arm. Gavin brought the papers. Said it's just a formality. I couldn't grip the pen. He said just do my best. I did. My hand hurt for hours. Ellie made me tea and rubbed my wrist without asking. She always knows. She should have the garden. I froze. I remembered that day. The cup of chamomile I left by her nightstand. The way she flinched when she tried to lift it. I had asked, did you fall? She said no. Just tired. I believed her. Or maybe I wanted to. Now I knew better. She hadn't fallen. She had been pushed by expectation. By the weight of Gavin's carefully rehearsed persuasion. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to leave bruises. My eyes drifted to the back cover. Something was tucked inside. A folded piece of paper, edges soft like it had been handled too many times. I opened it slowly. It was a photocopy, part of the property transfer paperwork. Faint, grainy. A triangle had been torn from the top right corner, and the ink on Mom's initials bled slightly into the paper fiber. But it was there. Clear, real, and unmistakably hesitant. I ran my thumb over the place where her hand must have trembled. Where she tried to do what was asked while knowing it wasn't right. This wasn't some legal formality. This was a quiet surrender. And tucked beside it. A post-it note, faded but legible. Keep this, just in case. M. My throat caught. She had tried to undo it. I held the page against my lap, the soft crinkle echoing under the quiet storm outside. There was something deeply human in her handwriting. The way the letters wavered, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to say what she truly felt. So she said it here. In private. With ink and paper instead of voice. I leaned back against the wooden headboard of the bed I hadn't slept in since my 30s. The floral wallpaper was still the same. Faded now. Just like the promises I thought were unshakable. I thought about calling Jordan. Maybe even Tina. But what would I say that Mom hadn't meant it? That she'd tried to reverse it? They wouldn't listen. Gavin would smirk. Tina would cite legal precedent. Jordan would ask if we really had to stir all this up again. Number. This wasn't about proving something to them. It was about seeing something for myself, and now I had. I ran my fingers over the notebook one more time, then pulled a fresh sheet from my own pad, the kind I used for grocery lists and quiet reminders, and began to write. Nothing elaborate. Just a sentence. A simple one. I was here. I saw the pages. I know what she meant. Then I folded it into thirds. No signature, no date. Just a note for later. Maybe for a lawyer. Maybe for no one at all. But I needed to write it because truth matters even if no one believes it. Especially then. I slid both notes, the photocopy and mine, into a clean manila envelope from the desk drawer. Sealed it. Wrote nothing on the front. Then I walked downstairs. The house felt hollow in the dark, like it was still holding its breath from the week before. In the kitchen, the sink held a single mug. Mine. The one with the crack along the handle that Mom never threw out. I washed it slowly, listening to the low rumble of thunder in the distance. When the water stopped, I heard the house again. The creak above the hallway. The tick of the grandfather clock. The sigh of something old remembering its place. I opened the cupboard above the stove where the flour tin still sat, moved it gently, and placed the envelope in the space behind it. The very place she'd chosen. A place for what didn't need to be said but still mattered. Then I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the quiet for a few seconds longer. Not sad. Not angry. Just still. Because something had shifted. Not in the world outside, but in me. She tried. She may not have done enough, or soon enough, or loudly enough. But she had tried. And, in the end, maybe that counted more than I thought. The next morning, I got a call. From the bank. About the joint account Mom never told anyone about except me. The program didn't have my name on it. It listed Gavin as the one giving remarks. Pastor Marianne would lead the prayer, followed by a hymn and coffee in the church basement. Neat. Predictable. Like they wanted grief to follow a schedule. I sat 3 pews back from the front, my coat still buttoned. Inside the left pocket, my fingers touched the edge of folded paper. The one I'd written after midnight, with the envelope from her notebook open beside me. The air inside the church was warm but not kind. The scent of wax and lilies lingered too long, clinging to the hymnal pages. The stained glass window to my left cast fractured golds and blues across the carpet. I remembered sitting here as a girl, bored during sermons, tracing those patterns with the toe of my shoe. Today, I didn't move. The slideshow flickered images of her with each of them. Mom holding Gavin as a baby. Mom with Tina in matching Christmas sweaters. Mom cheering on Jordan at a high school track meet. There were no pictures of her and me in the garden. No lavender. No birthday cakes in the kitchen. Just a quiet space in the middle where I used to belong. Pastor Marianne spoke gently, her voice soft and measured, as if any louder would crack the stained glass. She was a woman of faith. Of resilience. Of devotion to family, she said, glancing briefly toward our pew. Tina nodded like she approved of the phrasing. Gavin crossed his legs. Jordan looked down at his hands. I held my breath as the last prayer ended, the room shifting into stillness. Gavin rose first. Walked to the front with his usual polished grace, voice smooth as glass. On behalf of our family, he said, we thank you all for being here to honor Margaret McKay. She believed in kindness and giving, and in keeping this family strong. He paused, let the silence settle. And then he stepped back. The program said benediction. But I stood up, and the room forgot to breathe. I didn't ask. I just walked. My heels pressed gently against the aisle runner, each step sounding louder than it should have. Even the organist froze, her fingers hovering midair above the keys. I could feel every gaze on me, curious, confused, maybe a little annoyed. It wasn't my turn. It wasn't supposed to be me. But I kept walking, slow and steady, coat still on one hand in the pocket. Pastor Marianne tilted her head, eyes soft but uncertain. Gavin's brow creased barely. Tina sat very still, lips tight, jaw tighter. And Jordan shifted in his seat like he knew what was coming and couldn't decide whether to run or stay. I reached the pulpit and didn't look at them. Not yet. I unfolded the page with quiet fingers. The same page I'd pressed under a heavy book the night before so it wouldn't curl. Her words were there in ink that had smudged slightly at the edges. I didn't need a microphone. I wasn't on the schedule, I said, voice even. But I'd like to share something my mother wrote. I let the pause land. Then I read, Ellie should have the garden. She's the one who kept it alive. I let them talk me into things. I didn't fight. I'm tired. I'm sorry. A tremor ran down the pews. I didn't look up. Not yet. She gave up so much for me, I continued. And I wanted her to have something back. The garden was supposed to be hers. The paper crinkled slightly in my hand. The bouquet on the altar caught the light, just right, white lilies and faded lavender. I'd tucked in myself this morning from the last bush that hadn't yet given up. I folded the page again. Precise. Calm. Then I raised my head. And yet, I said, finally meeting Gavin's eyes, I wasn't even given a choice. I wasn't even given a choice. The words didn't echo. This room was too carpeted, too full of soft walls and softer egos, but I saw the ripple. Pastor Marianne lowered her gaze. Tina's hand clenched around the program in her lap, crumpling it at the fold. Jordan's jaw worked in quiet guilt, a rhythm of regret he hadn't dared voice. But Gavin crossed his legs and sat back. Arms folded. Expression unreadable, just the faintest trace of disdain, as if the mess I'd just made could be vacuumed up with the crumbs from the church cookies. I didn't break my gaze. She left behind more than a will, I said, voice steady. She left behind the truth. Then I stepped toward the altar. Slipped the folded page carefully into the heart of the bouquet. Lavender pressed against lilies, ink pressed against silence. She wanted me to have the garden, I said, to no one and everyone. And though the papers say otherwise, this is her voice. I turned slowly. The congregation didn't shift. No one whispered yet. No one clapped. But they watched. And in that stillness, in that stunned, frozen moment, I was seen. For the first time since she passed, I felt like someone was finally looking at me. Not the caregiver. Not the spinster daughter. Not the one who had no kids, no career, no stake. Just Ellie. The woman who stayed. I stepped down the altar stairs slowly, not because my legs trembled, though they might have, but because I wanted every second to count. The smell of old hymnals and lilies wrapped around me, cloying. The air felt thicker than it should have. Like the walls were holding their breath. I passed by Gavin without looking at him. But I saw the side of his jaw tighten. His shoe tapped once, then stilled. Tina didn't move. Her eyes were on the folded program in her lap, but I knew she'd heard every word. Jordan. He blinked at me, then looked away fast. His hands stayed in his pockets like they might keep him from choosing sides. I made it to the first pew where I'd left my coat and gloves. The lavender tucked into my inner pocket gave off a faint warmth through the fabric, like memory pressed against skin. I slipped my coat on one arm at a time, my purse over the shoulder. And then, without a word to anyone, I walked down the center aisle. Past the stained glass windows that cast fractured color across the carpet. Past the portrait of Mom in the slideshow that had now paused, frozen mid-laugh. Somewhere behind me the organ began to hum again. Tentative. Awkward. But no one stopped me. Not the pastor. Not my siblings. Not even him. I reached the doors. The kind with brass handles and old hinges that always squeaked, and I opened them to the chill of March air. Outside, the wind carried that late winter bite, sharp enough to sting the cheeks, but not bitter. I didn't shiver. The cold had nothing on what I'd already sat through inside. I walked toward the church garden, the one they kept up for Easter lilies and Sunday photos. Bare branches stood like questions waiting for spring. I stopped beneath the smallest tree, Mom's favorite. A dogwood, pale and twisted but resilient. From my coat pocket I took out the page. The one she wrote. The one they didn't want to hear. I unfolded it once more, not for me this time, but for her. Her shaky words, Her apology, her truth. Then, with hands that had buried her and fed her and carried the weight no one else, would I tuck the note between two stones at the base of the trunk. Not hidden, not loud, just there. Where roots could hold it. Behind me, the church doors never opened. No voices called me back, no footsteps rushed to explain, and that silence. It didn't sting. It freed. I didn't keep the land, but I kept the lavender. It sits now in a wide clay pot just outside the screen door of the little cabin I've rented for the summer. The porch creaks when I shift my weight in the swing, but it's a comforting sound wood remembering it's still here. Still holding something up. The lake below is still half-shadowed by trees, the morning light coming in slow like it's unsure if it should wake the world just yet. And that's fine by me. I don't need loud miracles. Just this. The breeze, the warmth on my face, the scent of lavender when I brush its leaves with the back of my hand. It's not the same plant, not exactly. The old bush back home, that home was too rooted. I couldn't dig it up. But I snipped a cutting the day I left. Wrapped it in wet paper and hope, and now it's growing again. Smaller, yes, but alive. I sip tea from a chipped blue mug I found in the kitchen drawer. It doesn't match anything. I like that about it. There's a letter beside me folded, once worn soft at the creases. It came a week after the memorial, tucked between a sympathy card from someone at church and a flyer for cemetery stone cleaning services. Pastor Marianne had written it herself. Her handwriting is small but steady. The kind that doesn't try to impress, just says what it means. Ellie, she wrote. Some truths are meant to be heard once so they echo forever. You gave yours room to ring. I keep her letter in the drawer now. Not because I need reminding, but because some things don't need to sit out loud, they just need to exist. Next to the pot on the small windowsill where the sun hits around noon is a photo frame. Inside is a single torn page. Not a photo, no smiling faces, just handwriting. Mom's. That last page. The one she tried to write when the world was already slipping from her. Ellie should have the garden. I didn't fight him. I'm tired. I'm sorry. I read it now not with grief, but with something gentler. Grief is sharp. This is rounder. Like a pebble you keep in your palm when walking. Heavy but smooth. I pick up a pencil. Not a pen, this isn't final. But I want to write something beneath her words. I sit for a moment staring at the page. The morning breeze lifts a corner of it, and then in slow, careful strokes I write, I forgive you. But I won't forget who I had to become to survive this. There's no anger in it. Just fact. I've learned that survival isn't always loud or glorious. Sometimes it's just one more breath, one more sunrise, one more lavender leaf unfurling. I place the frame back on the sill. Behind me the wind chimes sing barely there, like someone humming to themselves in the next room. I breathe in. Hold it, let it out. They got the deed. But I got free. And some mornings. That's enough. I didn't win anything on paper. But each morning I sit beside that lavender pot. I remember some roots don't need soil to grow strong. In this life we won't always be rewarded for love given quietly. But dignity isn't something others can take. And sometimes walking away with your peace intact is the boldest thing you can do. If we care for each other, the way we tend a garden with patience, with presence, maybe fewer things would go unsaid. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, I'd be honored to hear your thoughts. You're welcome to share them below. I'll be reading.